Peter B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, July 7th, 2020. At last, the former San Francisco 49er quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who famously took a knee, has been signed. And it's a starting position. It just isn't in the NFL. This struck me as surprising, but Disney, the multimedia and theme park conglomerate, has announced a production deal with the former football player Colin Kaepernick to produce scripted and unscripted stories that explore race, social injustice, and the quest for equity. And it's unclear if these will be put out as television programs. Disney does that. As movies, well, Disney does that, including animated stuff. And Disney also owns ESPN. And what's fascinating here is that in the package, it appears that Kaepernick and his attorneys negotiated pretty effectively. Because Jemele Hill, a woman who was one of the top anchors at ESPN, where she worked for 12 years, and who was fired after some public statements, I think they were tweets, about Donald Trump being a white supremacist. And at the time, Bob Iger, who now wears the big ears at Disney, he had gently stated that the head of the CEO of ESPN, the president there, Jimmy Pitaro, felt that she had gone too far. And delicately, says Iger, I happen to believe he was right. Now, that was in 2018. So, Disney does not have a stake in the NFL's vilification of Colin Kaepernick. Nor do they really need to get in Trump's face. Certainly, they're going to get slammed on the Twitter machine by the old man for hiring Kaepernick. Trump will call him divisive. But I think he's a very interesting figure. And I think that Disney is not doing this simply for a profit motive or to try to appear woke at this particular time. But putting aside their motives, I do think that this is a good development. And we'll have to see whether Kaepernick is given full voice. The deal is called a first look deal, which means that Kaepernick comes up with ideas, Disney pays to turn them into content, and then they have the right of first refusal, which does not guarantee that Disney will distribute the content that he creates. Kaepernick has also started a publishing company, plans to release a memoir. Ava DuVernay, the celebrated African-American director, is working with Kaepernick on a Netflix series about his teenage years. Oh, and he's got a shoe deal with Nike. And he's now on the board of directors of Medium, the blogging platform. And I want to hear more from him. I don't agree with everything he has ever said, especially related to politics and social justice. But I give the man a lot of credit for the courage that he displayed in taking a knee and standing, or that's the wrong phrase to use here, but maintaining that position. And it makes me think of my friend Ford Green. He's now the mayor of our little town. But as a member of the council, he started taking a knee during the Pledge of Allegiance. And some people think that's silly or trivial or cartoonish. But it's a statement that resonates with me, because I don't believe we should ever be required to recite a loyalty oath to a flag or to our government. So today I'm releasing the podcast that I promised you about a week ago on the 1st of July, when our new correspondent from Seattle, Jonah Leto, gave us the report on the police dismantling what came to be known as CHOP, the Capitol Hill occupied protest. And in an hour-long recap that we recorded earlier today, Jonah takes us through the stages of the protest that took most of the month of June, and the various indications from Mayor Jenny Durkin, who was initially talking as if she supported this expression via occupying turf, and who later shifted and then signed an executive order just before July 1st to allow the police to remove the protesters. And I consider it to be an important episode of the summer of 2020, the reaction to the police killing of George Floyd, and the reaction to the police brutality that was visited on peaceful protesters, including in Seattle. And so, among other things, I asked Jonah Leto to explain what the goals of the CHOP protesters were. And he said there were 3 of them. Here's an excerpt from that conversation.
So, personally, what I think the problem was the lack of some agreement within the CHOP experience. The 3 demands, of which none have been met, have been posted everywhere. They're on all of the barriers, and one's even spray painted on some plywood that used to be up on some windows that were huge. Mm-hmm. So those demands would be, number 1, defund SPD by 50%. Number 2, help fund black communities. I believe the demands on the large windows with plywood that I saw were a little different, but basically the same idea is to put the money that you defund SPD with to community relief funds. Number 3 is to free all arrested protesters. And I had an interesting talk with a man. I'm going to make this a little bit quick. The man told me that of all the demands that could be met, number 3 is the most reasonable because SPD in the city has absolutely nothing to lose by letting go of the protesters. And
so at this stage, we're on, this is now July 7th. Is there resolution? Have protesters been released, or are they prosecuting them?
No, not at all. More protesters are getting arrested, if anything.
That's our reporter Jonah Leto in Seattle, and I invite you to listen to the full interview. It's available today to subscribers at peterbcollins.com, at TuneIn, iTunes, Spreaker, and Stitcher, and many other places where you find podcasts. And I'm very impressed with this young man's reporting and the analysis that he offered in our podcast today. The protests continue, and one of the situations right now is in Bloomington, Indiana, where a black man was hassled by a group of whites. They threatened to break his arm and to beat him up. And that was followed by an episode on the streets of Bloomington, which is a sleepy college town where Indiana University is located. It's in southern Indiana, closer to the Kentucky and Ohio borders. And a 29-year-old woman, part of a Black Lives Matter protest in Bloomington, was injured last night after a car struck her and sped away with her on the hood of that car. A 35-year-old man, also part of the protest, who clung to the side of the car as it drove away, was injured. And the driver, whose motive is unknown so far, was able, I believe at this moment, is still at large. And like in Seattle, where Jonah Leto was a witness to an event in the early part of the occupation, I think it was on June 7th, when a man intentionally drove his car and plowed into protesters. And of course, the officers in New York City In the early stages of the Floyd protests, it was on a weekend, and the event occurred in Brooklyn, so it would have been in early June. The video went viral of this officer who was confronted by a group of protesters who used one of those movable barriers to block the police vehicle. It was an SUV. And I watched that video half a dozen times. And the police officer who ultimately just plowed into that barrier, knocking people down as he drove away, he had been pelted with some water bottles and a few other non-lethal projectiles that were hurled at his police vehicle. But his rear was completely unblocked, unobstructed. And he could have easily done a quick backup to get away from the barrier and the crowd. And he had a couple of escape routes to the right or the left. Mayor de Blasio, who did not really denounce that episode, allowed the police department to investigate that and exonerate the officer. And this whole trend of using vehicles to mow people down who you don't like or who you're afraid of is one of the copycat tactics that we've seen since Heather Heyer died in Charlottesville a couple of years ago. As we look at police reform, whether it's through defunding or shifting the responsibilities that we give to armed police officers like traffic stops, the Los Angeles Times did a deep study into 18 million calls that were logged by the Los Angeles Police Department since 2010. And only 8% were reports of violent crimes, defined as homicides, assaults with deadly weapons, robberies, batteries, shots fired, or rape. By contrast, police responded to a greater number of traffic accidents and calls recorded as minor disturbances. And so this gives us a data set to look at and say, well, do we need to send armed officers every time there's a call to 911 when only 8% of them relate to the direct responsibilities of an armed cop? So I think this is one of the areas that should be explored as we try to redefine what the standard municipal police department is expected to handle. And last week, the LA City Council voted to cut $150 million from the LAPD's $1.85 billion annual budget, but did not impose any changes on the duties or responsibilities of the officers. And later, the article describes what I was talking about earlier. The idea of removing police from traffic enforcement is under consideration in New York and L.A., where they propose replacing police officers with staff from the city's transportation department, or, and I've seen this in Singapore, they use robots and cameras to enforce the laws, and you don't get pulled over by a cop. You simply get a citation in the mail with a picture of the violation that they are alleging. And while there's a trade-off there with more surveillance, I support the general notion of relieving cops of traffic stops because that's where a lot of conflicts develop. That's where people get frightened and drive off. The cops then chase and often kill them. So a breakdown of 170,000 reports of the category called disturbances showed that the vast majority of those calls did not include a reference to violence and could possibly have been handled by people other than police. But in the disturbance category, about 17% of the time the caller referred to a weapon or a fight that might require a more heavily armed response. So I think this is interesting food for thought as we look for ways to fundamentally change the operations of police in this country. Now, this is a case where I don't believe we can blame the police. We have to ask ourselves, including in urban African American communities, why are so many armed people discharging their weapons, often in grossly irresponsible ways? So over the weekend in New York City, 65 people were shot, 87 in Chicago. And when you look at the death toll, over the holiday weekend, there was a wave of deadly shootings that left children dead. In Atlanta, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms said at a news conference that 8-year-old Secoria Turner, who was fatally shot while riding in a car with her mother last Saturday night, he said, "You shot and killed a baby." Washington, D.C., 11-year-old Davon McNeil was at an anti-violence cookout. He was shot dead. In Chicago, 7-year-old Natalia Wallace outside her family's house during a holiday gathering as shooting began. She was killed. And San Francisco's not immune. 6-year-old Jace Young was an innocent bystander when a shooter or shooters opened fire at a family gathering on the 4th of July. And there are more. But you get the point. In Atlanta, more than 20 injuries, 5 killings over the holiday weekend. It led its doofus governor to call out the National Guard, 100,000, to defend state buildings and allow the ordinary officers who handle those duties to be put on patrol. But you can't patrol every party. And this is a matter of personal responsibility. You can't blame Trump or bad policing when people choose to resolve their disputes at the end of a gun barrel. And I don't have a solution. These are complex issues. It relates to our media, which often presents guns and violence as the way to resolve personal disputes. Obviously, the limited regulation on guns, including in open carry states, allows people to reach for a weapon before they have cooled their emotions in a current situation. Then you have the gang members and other outlaws who you can say, or at least in part, are victims of a biased and racist criminal justice system. But that doesn't offer any rationalization for their resort to violence most of the time either. And as we try to value black lives, yes, they do matter, and yes, it is a bit of a cliche. But we have to challenge blacks to value black lives. And it's a tough assignment in America today. I've been so impressed with the work of Scott Ritter, former Marine intelligence officer, the weapons inspector who told us that Saddam didn't have any useful weapons of mass destruction in 2002, 2003. And he's a freelance writer. His latest epic, I printed it out, ran 46 pages over at Consortium News, is a blockbuster unpacking of what I call Russia Bountygate, and he just calls it Bountygate. And in a very deliberate, fact-based analysis, Scott Ritter goes through the recent leaked reports, starting with the New York Times, based on anonymous intelligence officials who tell us that the Taliban was receiving bounty payments from Russia, described as $100,000 for each American killed. Editor goes through the origins of the presidential daily brief and whether or not Trump should have been briefed on these claims. He talks about the president's current assigned briefer, Beth Sanner, what her job is, and how apparently she chose not to share with the president the intelligence that had surfaced at the end of February, claiming that these bounty payments were being made. And so he lays that out. And he puts it in context that at the very time that she was supposed to brief or could have briefed Trump about this, that Zalmay Khalilzad, now serving under his third president as an envoy toward Afghanistan, at the very same time he had secured a preliminary deal with the Taliban. So Ritter details the claims that are coming from intelligence, and then he applies his critical thinking. He notes both the CIA and the National Counterterrorism Center had assessed the finding that the GRU, Russian intelligence, had offered bounties to the Taliban. They assessed it with only moderate confidence, which in the spook speak means that the information is interpreted in various ways, that there are alternative views, or that the information is credible and plausible but not corroborated sufficiently to warrant a higher level of confidence. But the surveillance spooks over there assess the information with low confidence, meaning that they viewed it as scant, questionable, or very fragmented, difficult to make solid analytic inferences, and significant concerns or problems with the sources of the information used. And then Ritter says the problem was the intelligence assessment on alleged GRU bounties contained zero corroborated information. It was all raw intelligence. And there were serious disagreements among the differing analytical communities, in particular NSA, about its reliability. Moreover, none of the intelligence linking the GRU to the Taliban provided any indication of how far up the Russian chain of command knowledge of the bounties went, and whether or not anyone at the Kremlin, including Putin, were aware of it. So he also gives a lot of background on the efforts by the Pentagon and their political allies to keep American boots on the ground in Afghanistan, even though the small numbers today are meaningless in a sprawling country like Afghanistan. And near his conclusion, he notes, as I did last week, that Liz Cheney sponsored legislation that essentially locks the president into keeping some troops in Afghanistan almost forever, and that the House Armed Services Committee voted for that as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, that's the Pentagon budget, by a vote of 45-11. And Ritter says this, more than anything else, seems to have been the objective of the leak. The irony of Congress passing legislation designed to prolong the American war in Afghanistan in the name of protecting American troops deployed to Afghanistan should be apparent to all. In case you didn't drift, he thinks that is incoherent. And here is a strange lawsuit related to wounded and dead American soldiers in Afghanistan. Nearly 400 people who were either wounded or who are family members of service members who died in Afghanistan sued a group of companies last week they say helped fund attacks against Americans by making protection payments to the Taliban. Now, legally, this seems very convoluted to me, but at minimum, it points up the deep corruption in Afghanistan. And we have squandered tens of billions of dollars, propping up that government, wasting money on so-called reconstruction projects, funding their training up the military and the police, who don't respond terribly well to American-style training. And the argument here is that because these, war profiteering companies, GS4 Holdings, Centera Group, DAI Global, Kansas's Black and Veatch Special Projects, in order to survive in Afghanistan, they essentially paid protection money to people in the Taliban or Taliban leaders. And that's how they survived in this ongoing war zone. But those who are suing are saying that by paying protection money to the Taliban and in some weapons, that they are accomplices in the combat deaths and the woundings of American service members. That's the best I can explain it, and frankly, it doesn't make sense to me. There's some developments related to immigration. Foreign students whose college campuses will not reopen for the fall semester are being denied visas and told that they can just go home to the country, the shithole, where they came from, and zoom into their classes from there. And I consider this to be quite unfair. But I also think that there is a deep reality that universities who hold all of their classes remotely are going to be charging the same tuition and fees. And do students get fair value for that, whether they stay at home in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, or they stay at home in St. Petersburg, Russia, or in some place in... Also, on the immigration front, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals here in San Francisco, a 3-judge panel, has issued an interesting ruling, essentially declaring that the scheme that Trump has set up, essentially to deny anyone seeking asylum entry into the United States by requiring them to pass through a third country before they try to enter the United States from Mexico. So we have the case of people from Cuba, also, let's say, people from Nicaragua who want to apply for asylum at the Mexican border. They first have to go to Honduras or Guatemala or El Salvador, where there is no asylum program available. And even in Mexico, it is extremely limited. So this is a charade, pure and simple. And the court has seen through it and said that this cannot continue. Now, the clampdown on all forms of immigration, those who seek asylum, those who go through the arduous process of qualifying for a visa to come to the United States, those who marry an American and are entitled to come to the United States, well, they've all been put on hold. And the impact is that they're not paying the exorbitant fees to process their actions that are the biggest source of funding for the Homeland Security Department's subsidiary, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. 70% of the agency is facing furloughs because the processing fees that fund it have dropped to almost nothing. So as many as 19,000 employees may be furloughed as early as August 3rd. And the agency has asked Congress for an emergency bailout, saying they'll repay the money by adding more fees to the people who aren't allowed to pay those fees. Yeah, that really makes a lot of sense. Oh, and a new report from the Government Accountability Office found that Customs and Border Protection had spent $112 million meant for food and medicine for immigrants on all-terrain vehicles, dirt bikes, and boats. And so it goes. In Hong Kong, the law that was passed by Beijing to clamp down on really any public protesting or expression in opposition to Beijing or the Hong Kong government is already being implemented. The first suspects have been jailed. Some activists have fled Hong Kong. And now there's a battle shaping up that affects the tech giants of Silicon Valley. Because the new Beijing law mandates police censorship and covert digital surveillance. And this has led Facebook, Google, Twitter, Zoom, and LinkedIn to announce that they will at least temporarily stop complying with requests for user data from Hong Kong authorities. Now, you may have figured this out, but law enforcement can go to Facebook and ask to look at your page. And with a simple, either a national security letter from the FBI or using a court order, a warrant, they can apply for and be given, for a fee, access to your social media accounts. And so this has led to issues that these companies have to grapple with. And they're being threatened with essentially being blocked in Hong Kong if they don't submit to the new regulations imposed by Beijing. A Facebook employee could potentially be arrested in Hong Kong if the company fails to hand over user data on someone based in the United States who Chinese authorities deem a threat to their national security. So the law is very broadly written. These companies have debased themselves in efforts to win approval of the Chinese government to operate in China, and most of them don't. And TikTok, which is the kind of faddish new app owned by the Chinese internet giant ByteDance, says it will withdraw its app from stores in Hong Kong and make it inoperable to users there within a few days. And here the Trump administration is considering a retaliatory move to ban TikTok in the United States. Meanwhile, Facebook is now facing what has become a massive boycott by advertisers. And just a week ago, there was somewhere less than 100 firms, but now 750 companies have suspended their advertising on the platform, and their money generated $70 billion in revenue to Facebook last year. So Sheryl Sandberg, who has a personality, she fronts for Mark Zuckerberg, who's a little challenged in that department. She's announced a series of meetings with civil rights leaders who are expected to use the sessions to press Sandberg and Zuckerberg to make changes at Facebook, including installing a top-level executive who will ensure that the global platform doesn't fuel racism and radicalization. And these are thorny issues. We've talked about this before. I'm pretty radical about free expression. And up to a point, I support Facebook's effort to censorship. But that point is, where I don't agree, is that Facebook has already created censorship panels, including a former government official from Israel who was central to the efforts to stifle criticism of Israel by Americans, including BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction. The Atlantic Council, which is a front for oligarchs and big corporations, they have a seat at that table. And people like you and me, we don't. So it's going to be an interesting struggle. Zuckerberg and some of the other executives will be on Capitol Hill later this month, testifying about antitrust issues, but I'm sure some of these content and hate speech issues will surface too. And the Democratic National Committee is attacking Facebook for unkept promises. In a memo drawn up ahead of these meetings, the DNC accuses Facebook of failing to fulfill a series of promises it made following the 2016 election, including limiting sensational and hyperpartisan content, standing up a rigorous fact-checking program, and curtailing disinformation. And, of course, these are the people who think that Russia manipulated the 2016 election, including using Facebook. This has also surfaced as a central theme of the Biden campaign. Apparently, their polling shows that Facebook is unpopular and that Joe Biden can score points. They've issued a series of complaints to Facebook about how it enforces its rules for politicians. And I do agree that Trump's lies do not meet the so-called community standards at Facebook. And so there should be enforcement of those standards. And there is, we can argue over what actually comprises censorship. But I do think that Facebook has responsibilities that it tries to evade on a regular basis. As you know, listeners to this podcast, with a little help from yours truly, have created the Community Fund, and we are handing out $100 grants to people who can really use help at this difficult time. And today we respond to Amy Grammond, who writes, I've been listening to you for 4 months now, really enjoy the podcast. Your perspective has given me a new way of looking at the political news. She said, I'm writing because I heard about your Community Fund, and I'm one of those people who never wants to admit that I need any help from anyone. So then in all caps, she wrote, help. Okay, there, I did it. Yes, I need help since I'm not able to do the work I've always done to make my living. I'm a cleaning lady, and that makes it hard for me to survive. Folks aren't ready to hire me to come into their homes right now, and it's unclear when she will be able to get back to work. And that's why she's asking for a $100 grant. Well, Amy, I'm happy to send you $100. We'll get that taken care of today. Also, it was just coincidental, but as I was reading her email last night, I was watching the PBS NewsHour, and they did a segment profiling the plight of housekeepers and other domestic workers, including some undocumented people all across the country. And this is a group of people that typically works in the cash economy. They didn't get the $600 a week bonus federal unemployment money. And some people in California got money, $500 per household, out of the fund for undocumented people. But there are millions of people who have received no support and who were forced to stop working in March or April. So, Amy, thank you for coming forward. I know it's hard for people to ask, but you set an example for others who may want to send an email to peter@peterbcollins.com asking for a $100 grant from the Podcast Community Fund. You remember Purdue Pharmaceutical? They're one of 4 or 5 firms that profited immensely from America's addiction to opioids. And it's owned by the Sackler family. And the Sacklers took Purdue into bankruptcy even though they were not insolvent. but facing the liabilities of court settlements. And they offered a paltry $1 billion or so to settle all claims. Well, now we learn that despite the fact that they're in bankruptcy where you're not permitted to make political contributions, Purdue Pharma has made contributions to political funds like those for the Democratic Attorneys General Association, the Democratic Governors Association. And son of a gun, some of those attorneys general have the responsibility to negotiate with Purdue and the other companies on behalf of injured parties in their states. The Republican Attorneys General Association got even more than the Democrats did. So this is a sordid situation. And our political leaders who go on television and posture as, tough on these legalized drug rings, syndicates, if you will, then turn around and accept their money and use it in political campaigns. It's ugly. Here's today's COVID-19 update prepared by Linda Lewis. As of today, 11.6 million identified COVID-19 cases worldwide, producing 540,000 deaths. In the U.S., total confirmed cases as of today, 2.9 million. Total deaths edging up toward 131,000. And she adds a couple of data points. Total recoveries are just under 1 million, 924,000. Total tested just over 36 million. But what we're seeing as the numbers shift is as testing expands, the rate of positive results continues to climb. And that is the frightening prospect that is filling up hospitals in some parts of the country. We've seen the wave of infections down the road from me at San Quentin Prison. And currently, the number of fatalities has declined. And we'll get an explanation of that coming up here in our file in just a moment. But Linda starts with a letter from 240 scientists to the World Health Organization urging the WHO to revise its recommendations related to the spread of the virus from droplets that come from our sinuses through a cough, a sneeze, or just singing in a church choir. And this letter, published on July 6th, asked the WHO to make a change. And the CDC here in the United States, this is actually a different group, Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, says the lack of universal recognition that COVID-19 is transmitted via airborne particles, along with the unclear infection prevention recommendations, have led to a false sense of security that is putting the public at risk, especially amid reopenings of workplaces, schools, and colleges. The authors include Lydia Morowski, who is at the Brisbane, Australia, Director of International Laboratory for Air Quality and Health at the WHO, and an American Dr. Donald Milton, University of Maryland Public School of Health. Quote, studies have demonstrated beyond all reasonable doubt that viruses released during normal breathing, talking, and coughing are small enough to remain airborne and pose an infection risk to others nearby. There's every reason to expect that transmission via airborne microdroplets is an important pathway. Now, this seems like accepted knowledge to most of us here. But because of politics and the dance that the WHO has to do, it has not adopted clear protocols in this regard. Next up, Linda reports whether food is a transmission platform for COVID-19. Since a new outbreak of coronavirus in Beijing, Chinese authorities have been inspecting food imports and demanding The companies exporting food to China signed documents confirming compliance with safety standards to prevent transmission of COVID-19. Reuters reports that Tianjin, Beijing's primary port, started testing batches from every arriving container on June 15th. Authorities usually conduct food safety tests on a random sample of about 10% of frozen meat shipments. Now every container is inspected and boxes are pulled out for coronavirus tests. According to a Bloomberg article, the Chinese request isn't aimed at imposing trade restrictions. The requests are informal and they are to ease Chinese consumer concerns over the safety of imported products. So they found some seafood samples, salmon in particular, imported from Europe, in a market in Xinfadi, which I believe is, it's a wholesale food market in Beijing. The virus was discovered on chopping boards used for imported salmon, although the origin is not certain. At a briefing, authorities noted that patients at the seafood market showed symptoms earlier than those who worked in the beef and mutton section. So here is the CDC guidance currently for handling food. Their statement: currently no evidence to suggest that handling food or consuming food is associated with COVID-19. However, after shopping, handling food packages, or before preparing or eating food, it's important to always wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer. Cover all surfaces of your hands, rub them together till they feel dry with that stuff. And Linda has also delved into activities at Fort Detrick, Maryland. A military media outlet reported on July 6th that researchers there at Fort Detrick, our premier bioweapons laboratory, published a non-peer-reviewed research paper the same day. Linda says she checked it out and it looks legit. This is July 6th again. Researchers with the U.S. Army Medical Institute of Infectious Diseases found that the virus can live for days on animal skin, up to 4 days on pig skin, and remain stable on the skin at refrigerated temperatures for at least 2 weeks. Really? It is likely that any viral shedding from either symptomatic or asymptomatic workers in the absence of appropriate PPE would remain viable for an extended period of time on the surface of meat products or other surfaces. Well, this certainly raises concerns about the outbreaks at meatpacking houses, particularly in the Midwest. We're also learning that Fort Detrick, the scientists there have been working on a vaccine. At Fort Detrick, they're safely replicating the virus to support countermeasure development. The team at Walter Reed has designed a unique COVID-19 candidate. Detrick is also developing small and large animal models to support testing of vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics developed by the Army and its collaborators. And at this point, I have not eliminated Fort Detrick as a possible source for what we call COVID-19. And perhaps anticipating that comment, Linda included a citation here from Forbes magazine dated June 19th. A biodefense expert, whose name is Mark Kortepeter, has looked into the origins. He finds no smoking guns proving the virus was intentionally created in a lab. Quote, in the case of SARS-CoV-2, the only way to get closer to understanding its mysterious origin is to send an unbiased international team into China to conduct a formal investigation to determine the earliest humans infected, compare specimens in the Wuhan lab with human specimens, analyze similar viruses in bat and other animal populations. Finding specimens in the lab that existed prior to the current outbreak that genetically match human outbreak samples would be damning. Good luck with that, he says. That would only prove that the samples came from a lab, not whether the outbreak was started intentionally. Having someone who worked in the lab confess would certainly help, but I wouldn't bet the farm on that happening either. And absent that, the burden of proof on this outbreak that this outbreak did not occur naturally is high, because, as mentioned above, there are a lot of reasons to suggest that COVID-19 is exactly what it appears to be, an infectious coronavirus that spilled over from bats into a population that has already experienced a previous spillover event from a related virus. Well, that's an argument. I will continue to look for evidence to support facts. So Dr. Fauci is taking on the issue that I raised a couple of moments ago, that while the rate of infection is increasing, and in many regions the rate of hospitalization is increasing, the rate of death has actually been falling in recent weeks. So Fauci said on a Facebook Live news conference, it's a false narrative to take comfort in a lower rate of death. There's so many other things that are very dangerous and bad about this virus. Don't get yourself into false complacency. And Fauci said the median age of those getting infected has dropped by about 15 years, which is one of the factors he suspects has led to the decline in the death rate. Fauci, the death rate is lower. I admit that, because people in general who are young are healthier, but that doesn't mean you could not get seriously ill. He stressed that those who allow themselves to get infected by engaging in risky behavior can become part of the problem even if they don't experience symptoms. Even if you didn't know it, even if you're perfectly harmless, by getting infected, you're propagating this pandemic. And the would-be Trump of Brazil, the capital, Jair Bolsonaro, who has been just openly flouting the standards of protection that have been adopted worldwide. He shakes hands with people, he appears in crowds, he doesn't wear a mask, and he got the virus. He's 65 years old, and he was tested after experiencing fatigue, muscle pain, and a fever. Didn't stop him from having dinner with the American ambassador on the 4th of July. Okay. The United States, the Trump administration, has announced a contract valued at $1.6 billion with a company called Novavax that has never brought a vaccine product to market. And Novavax has agreed to produce 100 million doses of a coronavirus vaccine that, to my knowledge, does not exist. But the Maryland-based company, whose juicy ties to the Trump administration have not yet been figured out, well, they got $1.6 billion, and I don't know that that was a bid deal. It is described as a collaboration between Health and Human Services and the Pentagon. So that's in addition to the $1.2 billion that's been awarded to the British drug maker AstraZeneca and 4 other companies, Moderna Therapeutics, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, and Sanofi, have also received federal assistance for experimental coronavirus vaccines. And I think there's a lot of blue sky being promoted here and a lot of money being pumped out with pretty weak justification. And Johnson & Johnson is a company I deeply distrust. Most recently, they withdrew their baby powder and talcum powder products from the market without admitting guilt, but in response to claims that asbestos trace amounts were included in those products. And the Washington Post is reporting that a veterans nursing home in Spring City, Pennsylvania, the Southeastern Veterans Center, has produced a number of fatalities, 42 to be precise, and a number of residents who had not tested positive for coronavirus were nevertheless given hydroxychloroquine. And this goes back to April, about the time that Trump was touting it as a miracle drug. And it appears that the medical director, who has since been suspended, authorized the distribution of hydroxychloroquine as a preventive measure to, as I say, patients who had not been tested or had not tested positive. The outbreak at San Quentin is finally being addressed by state officials. They fired the top medical officer of the prison system, and the federal court-appointed receiver who runs the prison, Clark Kelso, removed Dr. Stephen Thurrott, and he issued this bland statement. In order to meet current response needs while also working toward further delegation of medical care, it has become evident that a reorganization is necessary for long-term sustainability. But what about the 6 men who have died at San Quentin since the prison system itself brought the coronavirus to a facility where it was not present? And the hospitals in Marin County, San Francisco, and nearby areas are taking an increasing load of sickened prisoners. And here in Marin County, the health director, Matt Willis, has put together a plan so that they're not, let me back up. There is a new plan to release more prisoners early. But our health director, Matt Willis, is making sure that those who are released and who require a quarantine are identified with a place to go, including a hotel room if necessary. And so I'm glad to see that they are taking steps, not just to drop somebody off and give them $200 in gate money and say, good luck with Rona. And here's the news we didn't need today. Chinese public health authorities are taking precautions to prevent an outbreak of bubonic plague in a remote northern region after a herder contracted the disease. In Inner Mongolia, in the area called Bianur, they issued a public health warning of the second highest level, saying that rodents might be carrying the bacteria. The government raised its alert level to standard plague outbreak alert, and that means that humans have been infected. Okay. we really didn't need that. In Oregon, Ron Wyden is the Democratic senator. He sits on the Senate Finance Committee, and for months now he's been asking the State Department to release documents as part of his investigation into Ukraine, and he is looking at some of the same issues as Republicans are. Is it true that Joe Biden used a $1 billion package of funding for Ukraine to leverage the firing of the nation's prosecutor? And the competing arguments are that the prosecutor was going soft on an investigation of Burisma, where Hunter Biden served on the board, or that he was investigating them inappropriately. And so Wyden is really pissed at Mike Pompeo. He wrote letters in February and May, no response. And he's now trying to escalate to Pompeo himself. He's also asking for documents related to Rudy Giuliani and any State Department employee who was involved with Vice President Biden and their counterparts back in the Poroshenko administration in Ukraine. I have been predicting, and I stand by it, that we're going to hear a lot more about Ukraine between now and November, and it's not going to be pretty for Joe Biden or his son Hunter. The World Socialist website does a lot of great reporting on issues ignored by the U.S. corporate media. And in a report dated July 4th, they say that Spain's Socialist Party, the Podemos government, was at the forefront of the U.S. orchestrated coup attempt in Venezuela this past May. This is where we sent those mercenaries in a Bay of Pigs style invasion. They were supposed to grab President Maduro and collect the $15 million bounty. Oh, yeah, bounties are terrible, right? And it turns out, according to this report, Leopoldo Lopez, who has been the longtime leader of the oligarch-backed faction, Voluntad Popular Party, he's been holed up at the Spanish embassy in Caracas for over a year, where he continues to plot for the takedown of the Maduro government. Interesting news. And a couple of more items to go here. Mary L. Trump, who is the Donald's niece, has leaked out a number of copies that the media have been able to speed read of her new book, Too Much and Never Enough: How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man. So she has run the gauntlet of legal efforts to keep the book from being published. And what we learn from Mary Trump, who's now 55, and as I mentioned, is the niece of the president, turns out she's a clinical psychologist. She says that her uncle has all 9 clinical criteria for narcissism. The fact is, she writes, Donald's pathologies are so complex, his behaviors so often inexplicable, that coming up with an accurate and comprehensive diagnosis would require a full battery of psychological and neurophysical tests that he will never sit for. Oh, and there are a bunch of, dynasty-style tales that Mary Trump is sharing, and we'll see if any of them, are worth reporting on. So finally, I want to be clear where this came from, because I got a great laugh out of this fake report, actual real fake news from The Onion. The headline reads, protesters criticized for looting businesses without forming private equity firm first. Dateline Minneapolis. Calling for a more measured way to express opposition to police brutality, critics slam demonstrators for recklessly looting businesses without forming a private equity firm first. Look, we all have the right to protest, but that doesn't mean you can just rush in and destroy any business without gathering a group of clandestine investors to purchase it at a severely reduced price and slowly bleed it to death, said Amy Mulrain, who is a Facebook user. She went on to say that, she echoes the sentiments of detractors nationwide who blasted the demonstrators for not hiring a consultant group to take stock of a struggling company's assets before plundering. I understand that people are angry, but they shouldn't just endanger businesses without even a thought to enriching themselves through leverage buyouts and across-the-board terminations. It's disgusting to put workers at risk by looting. You do it by chipping away at their health benefits and eventually laying them off. There's a right way and a wrong way to do this. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast today. You're free to share it absolutely everywhere. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain your humble host, Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.